Be handing around a summary of 668.5 on written arrangements that is sort of an explanatory language. But the only thing it's not stapled, and there are 2 pages. So be certain that as I pass it around, I'm going to pass it only one way to avoid confusion, because if I try to do it both ways, I'll screw up and not pass the pages. But when I pass it around, make sure that you take pages each. Okay. We are waiting for hard copies of the latest red lines, so this should be delivered anytime, hopefully. And I guess we'll get started, and we can at least review. I'll go over the agenda for the day. First of all, I want to welcome you all back to our subcommittee. Sorry the weather's not any better than it is, and hope you all had a nice trip in. I'm a little tired this morning. I didn't get to bed till 1:30, but it's not my own dissipated ways that caused that. I'm on a hallway with a lot of teenage kids who are on a trip, so they're making a lot of noise. And about 11:30 at night, as I was tempted to go out and say something to them, I flashed back to my own youth, in the hubris and arrogance of my teen years. Whenever adults yelled at me, I used to think, there's a pathetic old man whose best years are behind him, and I feel sorry for him because he's just yelling at a bunch of kids, and I figured, now I'm him. So I exercised the discretion being the better part of valor. I did not go out and confront said young people. So, because I want to be the cool middle-aged guy, not that guy. So,
You're not.
Thank you. So tonight, if they make noise again, I'm just going to go out and yell. You know, that's going to be awesome.
Greg, we just didn't want you to be in the hospital.
Yeah, yes, you know, but all night long, like the ice machine. How many times can you go to the ice machine? You know, it's like, how much ice do you need? Take a bucket. Anyway, and you know, kids, they slam the doors all night long, and they're just being typical teenagers. They weren't bad, but at this point in my life, you know, I've got one at home, and that's enough. And all right, so we do have the agenda here for. Let's just go over the agenda briefly and take a look at what we're going to be doing today and tomorrow. Starting this morning, we are going to. You see, what we want to do is, as you're aware, we have not gone over every change that we need to. So we do have some left we haven't addressed yet. In 668. But this morning we want to go back and revisit the definition of distance education and a correspondence course, state authorization of distance education. And David's going to walk you through that. We do have some red line changes there to look at. We wanted to do that because of what we discussed previously. These 2 topics are sort of, well, not by no means the only topics. They're sort of the major issues. So we wanted to go back and sort of address that early on and get that out of the way. You can see this afternoon, following lunch, we will have a discussion of EQIP, and we were requested to provide an overview update on EQIP. So, as it turns out, the department's foremost expert on EQIP is our very own David Musser, who's right here. So it was very convenient that we didn't have to go outside of our group to get that. So at 1:15, David will do a little overview of EQIP. I'll talk about that, answer any questions that you might have related to EQIP. And then you can see there that after we've completed that, we're going to go into the remainder of the agenda that we've yet to review. So you can see those items there that we did not broach in the last session that we had. Finally, Wednesday morning, we have accreditation definitions and other items previously reviewed, and that would be going back, looking at some of the things we reviewed before, looking at updated red lines. And then and Wednesday afternoon, the same thing. And then finally, what we want to have before we leave tomorrow, we want to make certain that we have time for this, because I think it's really important, is a discussion about reporting to the main committee. So obviously we want to have our people who are going to do that prepared so that they know what's expected and have what they need to go and do that next week. We have a pretty ambitious agenda. I understand that. We have a lot to discuss. So what I'd like to stress as we keep in mind as we go through the next 2 days is to try to direct your comments towards the topic at hand, either, and if, if we're discussing a topic, if you agree, you can make that point. If you disagree, it's very helpful if in disagreeing you can propose other language, or if you don't like what's there, what would you like to see? It's not a guarantee that that will happen, but as I said before, we want to make certain that the views of the entire subcommittee are shared with the main committee. So if you have disagreements with what's there, please let us know. If you believe, if your feeling is that we shouldn't regulate in that area, or we should keep the regulations as they are, you can make that point as well. But I think we should try to direct our comments to how we can get to something to recommend to the committee. So we would like to stay focused on that. We do have new red lines which will come shortly, which hopefully reflect some of what our discussion was last time. We have a couple other things we'll be handing out too. Some documents provided by members of the subcommittee we'll be handing out. We do have a response to a data request as well that we'll be doing. So hopefully everything will show up soon. But in the interest of time, I think we can get started here with our discussion. I don't think I have any more housekeeping items. As you can see, lunch will be promptly at 12. We'll try to take a break in the morning and one again in the afternoon. Probably go till 5 o'clock today. Tomorrow, I know all of you will be trying to get home, so we hope to conclude no later than 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So again, that gives us a fairly ambitious agenda. So if there are any questions anybody has before we start. Go ahead.
Good morning. Glad to see all of you again. I'm just curious if there's a plan to get what's being circulated to us online, or how other people outside of this room are going to have access to sort of all of the great thoughts that we've shared and whatever you guys will be sharing with us today.
We're going to post on the website everything that we give you, so that'll all be up there, so everybody will be able to see what happens here. I've heard our subcommittee has very good ratings, so we're Well, I'm not going to say by whom. I'm just saying that when I
was just wondering.
When our contracts come up for renegotiation, we're all going to demand a lot more. We get to that $1 million an episode thing and Friends or whatever, we'll be real good. We'll be like Game of Thrones. We'll only shoot one season and go a year and a half, and then somehow I don't think that's going to be happening. But wishful thinking. All right. That said, I'm sorry,
Jessica.
Jessica.
On the paper you just handed out, it says deliberative draft document not for distribution outside the department. Is that just leftover? I assume things like this can in fact be distributed to our
I don't
constituencies.
see why this couldn't be distributed. Yeah. This could be, yeah, it's for the committee, but now that it's been distributed to everybody, yes, you can share it outside this committee. Yeah.
Just making sure. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll take it off the next copy. Yeah, it's obviously been shared. There's nothing that we couldn't share outside the committee with us. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Musser, and he'll begin with a discussion of definitions of distance education and correspondence.
Okay, thanks, Greg. First, I'd like to start out with just a couple of housekeeping items about how we should address this issue. So the department, after our last session, went back and attempted to come up with red line language that reflected the discussions that were had at the subcommittee last time. We're still working on getting those printed for everyone this morning, and they'll be coming down here pretty soon. So while we wait for those, I'd like to go through the suggestions that we've received on each of these topics from the subcommittee members themselves, and ask you guys to kind of briefly go through what you've proposed, why you've proposed it, and maybe have a little bit of discussion around the table about how folks feel about those proposals. As soon as the department's language comes down, I'll do the same thing and explain a little bit about what we came up with, why we thought that it reflected the discussion around the table, and then we can have some further discussion about which things you guys prefer and which things you might want to recommend out to the full committee. The goal, as Greg mentioned, is to come up with suggestions that we can propose to the full committee, reflecting a majority, a minority, or everyone's view and recommendation for the topic. So with that, if it's okay with you guys, I would like to start with definition of distance education. And we received some language from Jillian and Leah. And if I'm reading this correctly, so we got some new language this morning from Jillian, and I believe it supersedes Jillian. We sent around some of that information, an earlier version of that last time, but this is the one that we should look at. We should disregard that previous language. Okay, so I will turn it over to you guys to talk us through what you've proposed.
Does everybody have their?
Yes.
And yeah, it is also up on the big screen, so folks who are on this side of the room, you may have to turn around if you want to watch Scott scroll through.
So I'll just start by saying I think this was sort of iterative on my first version, which was iterative on what the department had proposed to us. I think with respect to the first part where it talks about sort of the language that we're already familiar with in terms of the distance education definition and the technologies, trying to keep it as close to the existing statutory language, just because that felt like sort of the right thing to do and felt a bit safer. And then 2 and 3 are sort of new adds here. So 2, regular interaction is defined as being initiated by the instructor, and separately we propose actually defining what instructor is. So you'll see that at the bottom of the page. Occurring through predictable and regular intervals. So this is probably familiar language to Dave because it came off of a PowerPoint from I think a couple years ago when he was sort of talking about what regular is. And then covering the period of time prior to completion of all required assignments and demonstration of competency. So again, that language that was in the department's original red line. And then the substantive piece, we had conversation about wanting to make sure that we're acknowledging the accreditor role in this. And that I don't think, in the spirit of the triad, I don't think we're interested necessarily in having the department define what sort of academic in nature looks like. And so tried to bridge that the best we could with delivering an academic process consistent with SAP requirements that engages students in teaching and learning and providing systematic and continual assessment of student learning outcomes. So trying to put some guardrails around that. And then in 600.2 propose the definition of instructor. So I can read that. An instructor can include one or more persons employed by the institution, making up an instructional team so long as this team includes at least one faculty member as defined by the criteria established by the institution's accrediting agency, who independently or as a member of an instructional team must provide regular and substantive interactions to students. I don't know if you want to add anything, Leah.
I'll just add some insights from conversations I've had with accreditors, because the prior language, referenced as determined by accrediting agencies. One of the concerns brought to me was, would this set up kind of 15 or 18 different ways based on the institutional accreditor, how this is determined, and then what would be the ripple effect when program reviews were taking place and kind of coming back to the accreditor's rules on regular and substantive. So one of the deliberate recommendations that we had here was to make this language that would fold into all accreditation activities and fold into all program reviews that are looking at distance education for Title IV gatekeeping purposes. I just wanted to make that clear. And then the other piece of this is, as we're thinking of instructional models, and different ways that students are learning in distance ed, whether it's adaptive technologies, competency-based, direct assessment. We wanted to get away from measuring length and instances in terms of time, but more academic progress, evidence of student learning, rather than a touch point once per week that may or may not be meaningful to a student. What is a meaningful assessment activity, and that's why we wanted to build satisfactory academic progress into this. Typically, satisfactory academic progress is reviewed by accreditation, in conjunction with a renewal or initial accreditation. It's typically followed up on every time an institution works through substantive changes, adding new programs. So it's really kind of baked into quality assurance with accreditation, which is another reason why we wanted to add that. We collaborated with Russ, who had some viewpoints based on some conversations he had. So I wanted, Russ to kind of share his input, and we added a note. We've had some back and forth about initiations of activities between students and faculty being done by a faculty member. So I would like Russ to talk about that, and then we'd just love to hear from all of you what your reactions are to this proposal, and see if we can get somewhere, maybe towards consensus among this group as to what we could recommend to the main committee. Thank you so much for listening.
So thank you, yeah, and thank you for your work on this. And then the feedback that I've been getting from some of the competency-based education people is that it's a and I may be calling on David, who has a lot of experience with this, to maybe give some of his thoughts in terms of working in a competency-based program. But with competency-based education, I've had feedback from a few institutions that say that the initiated by the instructor ends up being problematic at times, because the nature of competency-based education, that there are times where you set up a general plan either with the instructor or with the academic coach or whoever's working with them, or with both of those, and then that there's the next thing happens, or the student then indicates that they're ready for the competency exam when they've done the work. And I know that's on the slippery slope towards correspondence education, but it is there's far more interactivity in what's going on in competency-based education than there is in either correspondence or in the traditional course, in terms of that there's a lot more back and forth between what's going on with the instructor, and sometimes that comes from the student. The other is through what to do about predictable and regular intervals on that. When you have a program, when you have a instructional model that is almost by definition irregular, how do we get that? And so had been working with Jillian, Leah, and we were coming up with all sorts of ways to work on this, and we didn't put anything forward. But those were definite issues that were brought up, and one thought that we had was, the closest thing we have to a solution is to try to define competency-based education, if that's allowed, and then somehow have a carve out for that in the distance education mode as one way to, that's the best way we have right now in terms of moving forward, but certainly are interested in feedback from others, because as Jillian and Leah know, Lord, we tried other things to try between the last time and this time, and seemed like we were getting more complicated than we'd have things that would be hard to do. But David, I'd be curious, I have not worked directly in a competency-based program. You have, and wondered if you could give, if I could call on you to give some light on this.
Sure. I thought that the language the department proposed earlier was better for CBE. This sounds to me like we're going back to where we were before we started this process. The instructional team issue is an important issue, and here I think we're going back to the instructor. The team is now in the background, and the regular and substantive has to be initiated by the instructor, which is where we were before. The periodicity is not clearly defined here, but I don't know if it's still a week or what it is, but I just, my sense is that the language before was certainly better from the perspective of a CBE program, especially direct assessment. My other concern, and I voiced this last time, is that I just don't think we should be bifurcating the online CB stuff from regular face-to-face instruction. So if we're going to require regular and substantive, then let's require it across the board. I just don't see the reason for the bifurcation.
Denise, did you have something?
No, Russ, you did point out, but I just want to make clear again that we do have to be careful and make sure that we are distinguishing between distance education and correspondence, because that is in the statute until that is changed. We got to make sure, but I understand what you were saying about the competency-based part of it. And in our proposal, we did try to address that so that we could possibly carve out, because from an enforcement perspective, from the department's oversight responsibilities, we wouldn't want to just make it a blanket where they could be at any point in time in the process. That's why I think you guys put in the SAP part. But so for the oversight part of it, but we are trying in our proposal, when it ever gets here, to accommodate both. But we do have to make sure that we still have that distinction, since it is in the statute. So whatever proposal goes forward, we have to have some kind of differentiation between the two.
Go ahead, Jody.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond again to David. I mean, this was the same, I think, debate we had last time, and I understand what you're suggesting, but again, there's no statutory authority to apply regular and substantive interaction to traditional academic programs on campus. I mean, that's just beyond the scope of the department's authority in terms of regulation. So that would be up to Congress.
Jessica.
Just as a process point, so are we waiting on red lines on this exact same language that we haven't seen but you guys have seen, and that's under, like, your comments are reflective of what you know is coming?
Well, yes and no. We are going to share that with the group, and our comments right now are just based on this discussion and this particular red line. When we get to that point, we'll talk about what we had in mind, and then we'll join in the discussion on that particular point too. But we're specifically talking about this language and what it brings up at the moment.
David?
Last time we also talked a little bit about tying regular and substantive to the definition of the credit hour. Are we going to revisit that as well?
Well, at least from our perspective here, it's more about what you guys want to do. So if you guys want to, hold a vote to see who is interested in pursuing that, you guys can decide to go further down that road. But it's really about whether you guys think that's a viable alternative, and if there's enough folks who think it is, then you guys could come up with some language for it. If not, then it might not be worth going down that road. So I think it's up to you guys, the committee.
I was just going to say, I think I said this last time, but then remember we have clock hours too, so I guess I'm unsure. Say more. I don't know what to do with that, right? Trying to figure out how to stick that into a credit hour definition when we still have clock hours to account for.
I agree, but I think it's worth exploring, because again, I'm concerned that we are treating online and CBE in sort of this separate way, and yet the credit hour applies equally to both. And so I think we need a common definition for all of it. That's why I keep pushing this issue.
Jessica.
Sure. I guess I think it might help to frame this conversation by thinking about why Congress enacted the statute that requires regular and substantive interaction for distance education. And my understanding is century-long, decades-long history of abuse of students in correspondence courses. And I think that if that's what Congress had in mind, I think that we need to think about a way to effectuate this requirement that really protects students. And I understand that maybe that doesn't make sense in 2019 to you. I don't particularly have a view either way, but I think that the point of this is to protect students. And so I think if we're thinking about how to do that, there are some things in this proposal that still raise concerns for me. I think particularly the members of an instructional team, and we may just have differences with people here in the room. But I'd like to hear maybe from the people who proposed it, what exactly in this proposal you think protects students and why you put it in.
Russell, did you have something?
Well, to respond to Denise and Jessica, I think that's our goal too, as well as to protect students on this and try to come up with something. The problem has been is that we now have an innovation that was not thought of back in 1992 when this first came about. That something has moved, and it actually, when done well, and even often when not done well, it has actually more interaction than what you see in the regular face-to-face course, in a distance ed course or a correspondence course. If we're going by that word interaction, that was the word that was in there, and then somehow it got defined as only being by the instructor later on. And so it seems like if we have an educational model that actually is serving students and serving students well, that whatever the language is, and we've been struggling with that we should be able to come up with some language that allows for that educational model, I guess is the point that I'm getting at. And so I'll leave it at that.
David.
So I actually just had a quick question before we go on about what you guys proposed. You had a connection with the satisfactory academic progress requirements, and I just wanted to understand kind of what you had in mind with that when you're talking about interaction with between instructors and students.
So satisfactory academic progress is a policy institutions have that says, at these certain points across a course or a program, there's going to be an assessment that evaluates how the student is doing meeting the stated learning objectives. And so we thought it made sense to kind of tie the regular and substantive interaction to an existing policy at the institution that says, at these points within the program, typically 1/4 of the way, 1/2 of the way, 3/4 of the way, and then a cumulative assessment at the end would be good benchmarks in terms of where faculty are interacting with students, and a good way to look at that. Seems to me that for distance ed programs, we're very caught up in a jet stream of having a lot of documentation for how regular and substantive is met. I've gone on many a site visit and looked at everything from, threaded discussions to faculty's highly individualized comments for every single student on multiple assignments. So that we know a lot about these interactions in a distance ed setting. How can we frame this in a way that can be appropriate for other models of learning? Maybe that's not replicating what's going on in a classroom in a traditional setting, but that takes into consideration instructional teams and adaptive models, education technologies, a lot of different ways students are undergoing their studies in higher ed.
Thanks, Leah. That's helpful, and I understand the intent, I think, behind connecting it with a pre-existing policy that an institution may have. As one technical matter, for the most part, the statutory definition of a correspondence course is at a fairly granular level, so it's at the course level. So the department's hope is that when we define distance education, we can define it in an effort to distinguish it from a course, so it needs to be granular at the course level. Generally, satisfactory academic progress policies are higher than the course level. They tend to be program level, how well you're doing in a given program. But we're open to that idea. I just want to be clear that when we talk about distance education, we generally are talking about how a specific course or competency or a fairly granular unit is being conducted.
Jody?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise this general concern I have. Russ sort of alluded to the fact that, a lot of these programs were not being envisioned back, in 1992 or in 2008 even. We weren't there in the last couple times that there were major reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act. And I just concerned overall about the prospect that with such a complex and specific statutory scheme that some of the proposals in this negotiated rulemaking are going beyond what is in the statute. And I understand the need to innovate, but the department, it's not up to the department to reauthorize the statute or to legislate via regulations, and particularly with Congress actively involved in bipartisan negotiations over the Higher Education Act, that I'm worried that we're exceeding our authority here. Particularly, we're talking about putting definitions in for things like CBE that aren't even mentioned or contemplated in the statute. So this is just a concern that permeates this whole process for me.
Marty?
Here are my comments. I'm trying to take what Jody just said in light of them. Think about some of the things David said and Russ said and Jillian said that have been said around the table. I have a couple of thoughts. And then, David, your comment a bit on, you started off saying bringing it to the course level and then to the competency level. And I don't know how we have those conversations without at least talking about the credit hour and clarifying how they stand. I do want to get back to something that David said earlier in re-identifying the instructor. And as I read this language where it says initiated by the instructor, in a distance ed course, that's often pre-programmed into a course. And we train our faculty to sit back and let the students, especially adult students, interact, and we try and get them purposefully not to micromanage a discussion. So I'm wondering, in the eyes of initiated by the instructor, was the idea that if we have an online course and we know that at week 2 these discussion questions are going to come up, they're programmed into the course, we know they're automatically going to access themselves. That's really no different than when I teach online. I know in week 2 of macroeconomics what I'm going to bring up. So I'm just trying to get a feel. Would that be the instructor, or are we doing a little bit of what I think David was worried about in redefining the instructor into this living, breathing, real-time person, even if we programmed some of it into the software and the course design? I don't know if that makes sense.
Amanda?
I just had a question on the language of when you mean learning outcomes and substantive interaction is defined as, and then providing systematic continual assessment of student learning outcomes, and then in the previous I point engages students in teaching and learning. When you mean learning outcomes, how do you think that might get interpreted as? Like, how is that usually measured? Just through tests? Or can you, I just want to make sure what that would be interpreted as by the creditors.
Leah?
Well, let me answer Meredy, and then I'll answer Amanda. As we thought about this and thought about the faculty role, I guess we wanted to kind of honor the leadership that faculty brings, and not necessarily in every instance of interaction is the faculty initiating. I mean, the faculty initiates something when the course is designed and is put online. I mean, that's initiated by faculty. We were just trying to give this some distinctive features that maybe we could feel comfortable with as different from correspondence. With respect to assessing student learning outcomes, I mean, typically that's stated, at the course level, program level, institution level, and we expect institutions to map their curriculum across these outlines and have appropriate assessments, whether, it's a written assessment, maybe a verbal presentation, an exam, those types of things. So they all kind of tie together to the overarching institutional program outcomes, and then at the course level, we're looking across the curriculum to how these assessment activities are taking place at appropriate intervals.
David?
I thank you guys for what I found to be a very helpful discussion. I think I understand the intent behind a lot of these proposals, and I think it may be that the committee can talk about making some of these as recommendations. I would like to move to talk a little bit about what the department came up with, and one quick thing before I do this, I do want to apologize that we haven't gotten this to you before now. We've put a lot of work into this. We've done our best to try and explain it as we go, and we hope to get paper copies for you guys so that you can actually look at them. And I would also say that we don't necessarily expect to get this morning to a place where we're going to be able to make recommendations, but we do want to try and get through a description of what we did and at least explain and answer your questions about why we did these things after the last discussion. So folks who are on this side of the table, you might want to turn your chairs a little bit until we can get paper to you. But Scott has all of this on the big screen up here. Thank you, Scott. All right, so
David, could you give one moment to Jessica?
Are
sure.
paper copies coming soon enough we could break now and then get them?
I think it's too early to break.
Okay, this is really hard.
Well, when paper comes, if we need to do another quick review, we'll do it.
Yeah, one thing I can do is give a high level description of what we're doing, and we'll get to you want.
That's a good idea.
Okay. And we will take a break for a little while and try to get those to you as quick as we can. Go ahead, Jessica.
I just have real concerns that if the department wants our meaningful feedback on your proposal, you've worked very hard on. This is not a way that I feel like is accomplishing that. I don't feel like I can see very well. I haven't had a chance to think about it. I haven't had a chance to give it to my constituency. Okay. Maybe others in the room are better on their feet.
I'm amenable to a break. However, I cannot 100% guarantee they'll be here when you get back. We'll do everything we can to see that they get up here at the time. So why don't we, pardon? Yeah,
we can circle back.
Yeah, we'll come back. So I apologize for not having this available. It's 9:40, so let's take a 15-minute break. It's 5 to 10, and we'll see. Hopefully at that point in time they'll be here. Okay, we're going to start back up. Denise very kindly went up and made some copies of Part 600. So for this purpose of this discussion, we do have material that we can refer to. So I'll turn it back over to David.
So thanks for the copies. I guess there's a lot in here, and I am a bit concerned about just handing them to us and then asking for feedback without time for any of us to read through these. So I know we're in a tight timeline and schedules and whatever, but at the very least, for the next time all these new red lines are coming to us, I would suggest and please ask that you give it to us. I thought we had heard a week in advance, and
Well, I understand your frustration at that. We did make every effort to make that happen. Unfortunately, we were working on changes pretty late, but I do understand what you're saying. We'll definitely take that back.
yeah, I would just say, I mean, I think we can try and give thoughts now, but I just would like to reserve, on behalf of all of us, the opportunity to come back again to these red lines and give additional thoughts, because I think asking us to respond on the spot is going to be challenging.
All right, we'll certainly allow that. We'll certainly let that happen. We're not going to preclude future comments on it. I understand that it's a tight time frame, but we ask for now you to do the best you can with it. But yes, I'm not going to preclude coming back if you have other insights based on having studied it further.
Denise?
And I also just wanted to say, most of that is other stuff that we'll probably be dealing with tomorrow or later. But it's a bigger stack, but I wanted to get you just the distance ed stuff. But I just copied the whole thing to make it easier. We certainly understand.
I believe Scott has copies of everything now. So
I already did 6.
you're getting a colorized version of it.
Greg, may I make a comment that next time, I think, even if, maybe we don't have to wait till they're done in their entirety, so before the next meeting, if you have part of it, then we can take it on us to do it in pieces, and that might relieve some of the stress of getting it all done.
Okay, we'll definitely we'll take that back. We'll make every effort to get these out earlier next time around.
And yeah, as you guys get the copies, I think what we'd like to do, given the very short time frame that you guys will have to look at this over the next couple of days, we're going to go through it now. The department is going to take some time to explain what we've done. Give you guys a few minutes to read through, ask a few questions, and then we'll come back to it tomorrow, probably with these topics later in the day, after we've gone through the remainder of the agenda. So hopefully that gives you guys at least a little bit of time to look through these. But we definitely do take your criticism seriously here, and we'll make sure that we get this stuff to you a little earlier next time.
Does everybody have 668? Okay.
And just to clarify, if you guys could take a look at the definition of distance education on starting on page 3, that's what we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. Do you guys need another minute, or do you want to me to start going through the language piece by piece and explaining the intent, and you guys can kind of follow along with that in that way. All right. All right. So I'm going to start back up at the beginning of the definition of distance education. So here, last time we heard from the subcommittee, and we heard a little bit of it today as well, concerns about having accrediting agencies define distance education or regular and substantive interaction as a whole. Concerns ranging from the complexity, the lack of standardization, concerns about program reviews, how it would be enforced, et cetera. So the department took that back and came up and went back to a concept where the department itself would define the term. And that's the first thing that you see here. The second thing that we did, well, this is actually that's the main gist of the changes that we made in that first paragraph. And I'll pause there. Do you guys have any other discussion about that concept? We've heard, I haven't heard very much support for accrediting agencies defining distance ed or regular and substantive interaction. So is there any other discussion about that concept? Okay. So it is, actually, can I ask you guys, in general, do you prefer that the department define this term? Is there, and maybe I should ask, is there anyone who doesn't feel the department should define this term? The distance education, sorry.
I'm sorry, are you asking if we want us to eliminate the existing statutory
No.
definition, or if you want us to?
I'm asking. There's two options that have been presented up until this point. One option is to have accrediting agencies define the term distance education. That's what the department originally proposed, and the other option is to have the department define the term. And what I'm asking now, because we haven't heard anyone speak out in support of accrediting agencies defining the term, if there's anyone who wants to speak on that point, or if the subcommittee is generally in agreement that the department should define it.
David?
I think the department should define it. I mean, otherwise you run into chances where there are subtle differences between how the individual accreditors define it. So I think, I mean, you guys are good at this. Let's go with your definition.
Okay. Any other comments on this point? Okay. So that's the first piece. If you go to the next page, we made, I think, of what we think is a fairly minor change to the types of media that can be used to carry out distance education. What was in the regulation before was largely directly derived from the statute, and we simply changed that to other media. The statutory language does obviously is the basis for all of this. So, we still can't diverge from that, but we felt that there could be media that's incorporated into those concepts that are in the statute. So we simplified the term a little bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is the much bigger point about the concept of an instructional team. So the department took back a lot of comments and discussion last time about the concept of an instructional team. So as you guys know, that was we proposed the concept of an instructional team as a means of providing regular and substantive interaction. But what we heard from the group was that number one, there was a desire to incorporate the concept of a subject matter expert into an instructional team. There shouldn't be an instructional team that does not include a subject matter expert instructor. And we also heard that an instructional team ought to be designed so that students get their questions answered in a timely way by a subject matter expert. A person should be available to answer questions and should essentially be someone who is able to work with students as needed. So we made a number of changes to what we had originally. You see most of what we originally had is redlined out. And so to Romanet 1, we define an instructional team specifically instead of incorporating it into the concept of substantive. And we define it as including at least one individual who is a subject matter expert by virtue of academic credential or work experience, and as defined by an accrediting agency. So here's the point at which we defer to the accrediting agency for what constitutes a subject matter expert. And one or more staff members that perform an instructional function. And then some of this language is similar to what we originally had. Members of an instructional team may have different and complementary roles and qualifications as required by the accrediting agency, such as to share information, answer questions, provide direct instruction, provide assessment or feedback, monitor progress, or provide student support related to the student's success in a particular course or competency. So that's the first part of the definition. And then we added a second part, Romanet 2. An instructional team must ensure that it monitors each student's academic engagement and success, and ensures that an instructor is responsible for promptly and proactively providing academic assistance when needed on the basis of such monitoring or upon request by the student. Again, focusing on the need for prompt and useful feedback from a subject matter expert when needed, or if the institution's system for monitoring the student identifies a need. It doesn't have to be something that the student initiates. And in fact, what we have here presupposes that the instructional team is keeping a very close eye on the student and is identifying cases where the student needs extra support. So those are the two components that we've built into the definition here. And then the third, Romanet 3, is the same as what we had before. General academic advisors or counselors are not considered to be members of an instructional team. So if you have someone who's just helping students identify which courses they're going to take, how to get through their program, career interests, that sort of thing, those folks are not part of an instructional team under this definition. So I'm going to pause there. And as you guys have said, I know you haven't had much time to look at this or think about it, but is there any questions at this point? We're going to come back to this tomorrow and talk about it some more. So, but I want to ask, no. So I want to make sure I get questions asked if you have them now.
Jillian.
So can you, or I don't know, Leah, you're like my go-to for the accreditation perspective. I'd like to better understand what a subject matter expert by virtue of academic credentials or work experience means, and what you envision that does to the faculty role as we understand it today, because this feels like a cheapening of that a little bit. And so I'm trying to understand, one, from an accreditor perspective, like creating a new construct like this, what does that mean? What does that look like? And then also the department's perspective on that. I have other questions too, but I'll start with that one.
Originally, actually, and I'll give you an inside look into how this was developed. Originally, we simply said instructor. And then looking back at our notes from our discussions, we realized that folks had said subject matter expert, and that was the important concept for this. So we used the term subject matter expert, but the department also wanted to ensure that we didn't keep it so narrow that it suggested that an accrediting agency needed to have someone with specific academic credentials. It would still be based on what the accrediting agency defined, but it could be either something based on work experience or academic credentials. But ultimately, we had envisioned this as being the accrediting agency's decision. It could be either one.
So an institution could have 0 faculty as we know them today, based on this proposal.
Not if their accrediting agency didn't define them as faculty.
But if their accreditor says that's okay, and especially sort of understanding that there are broad changes potentially to the accreditor model, you could have an institution that doesn't have faculty.
Well, again, what we're saying is that as the accrediting agency defines it, they do need to have subject matter experts that meet the accrediting agency's qualifications. And I can't speak to what the accrediting agency might say, but that is the department's view.
And I just wanted to, I guess, understand exactly what you're talking about. So you think by the way it's defined here, that would not be a faculty I guess Leah may be able to answer that from an accrediting
I don't know what
perspective.
a subject matter expert by virtue of work experience is. So I understand by virtue of academic credentials, I think that looks largely like what we have today. I don't know what a subject matter expert by virtue of work experience means and how that compares to how we understand what the faculty look like today.
I just wanted to understand your concern. Okay.
Thank you.
It was David. Yeah, he was up first.
So I don't have a problem with this. In general, I think I did have a problem with the term faculty in a lot of these because a lot of institutions, especially traditional institutions, define faculty very specifically. And so that makes it challenging to create instructional teams where you force traditional faculty into that role because it may not be appropriate. So I think this is fine from my perspective. My question is, the way that you have to Romanet 1, if general advisors and counselors can't be on the team or they don't count, who else is on it besides the subject matter expert?
So as it's written now, it's someone who is providing support for a specific subject. So we haven't gotten to the definition of substantive at the bottom, but the definition of substantive is very simple in this version, and it simply is related to the subject matter in a course. So as I mentioned before when we were talking about the language that Jillian and Leah proposed, the department views this distinction as happening at the course level. So academic support at the course level and in conjunction with a subject matter expert is what we mean. So an advisor may be pointing students to materials that would help the student through the course or competency. They might be actually tutoring, providing direct instruction. They might be doing webinars, holding discussion groups, the kinds of things that are happening within a course, but that are directly related to actual content. That's what we mean here.
Okay, so just so I understand, so for example, a grader who's just doing the mechanics of grading would be somebody who could be on the team, but would not be a subject matter expert in your definition. Is that right?
Well, not necessarily. If they meet the accrediting agency's requirements for being a subject matter expert, then they might be in that case. Let's assume, though, given what your question was, that you've got someone who doesn't meet the accrediting agency's requirements for being a subject matter expert, but they're doing some limited grading of some of the students' work, providing some feedback, et cetera. I think an analogous concept might be a TA. Or someone who was a lower level student who is doing student teaching. That person could certainly be part of an instructional team, but they wouldn't be a subject matter expert. They wouldn't qualify as that subject matter expert that's supposed to be also within that team.
Meredith?
Yeah, I like the language. I think you guys did a good job of capturing what we discussed. I was going to say the TA is an example, though we don't necessarily call it a TA in this world. I am, like David, I'm very concerned with using the term faculty. In traditional institutions, that has a strong terminology. In New Jersey, it's in statute. So I think we just need to be really careful that we don't, the faculty identify as the faculty in a traditional institution, and they may or may not be on these teams. So I like it. I did want to give an example of where I would see a subject matter expert. In an example, and this goes back years ago, but when I was with an institution that taught airport management, we would have somebody, there is no terminal degree in airport management, so we'd have somebody who was an airport manager with an MBA teach undergraduate airport management. And that's an area where the accreditor kind of flexed with us to say there is no airport management degree, but there is also nobody better to teach this course than somebody who's been running a large airport. So that's an example where I saw it. There may be other examples, I think, on some of the more applied or technical fields, but that was my, so I have to say that I like the changes as you've made. I think you captured it.
Amanda.
I just wanted to know what the Department of Education's intention was behind defining an instructional team based on our. So I understand that you did the revisions based on our discussions. So I think I want to ask again, what based on those discussions, what really changed? What was the intention by this definition, the instructional team definition, to have either the subject matter expert or the members of an instructional team deliver the instruction? Because as it reads now, it's still almost, it's worded differently and has more parameters, but to me it still reads as it could be the instruction that would be delivered to a student could be from a subject matter expert or those who are an instructional team. And I think based on the discussions we had, I think it was, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the point that I was most concerned with was that I would want at least the student to be guaranteed not just instructional team members or a subject matter expert, but definitely a subject matter expert. And of course, if it's an instructional team member, sure to support the student in giving feedback and guiding them throughout the course. But here it's still not doing that based on our discussions, in my view. So I just wanted to know if that was, how is it different in guaranteeing that there's a subject matter expert for sure providing the instruction rather than just, it could be an instructional team members or the subject matter expert?
That's a good question. So the department's intent with this definition was to incorporate as much of the discussion as we could last time. We did hear that request that there be a requirement for direct interaction between the student and the subject matter expert. We didn't incorporate that in this draft. We're obviously open to that if the subcommittee decides that they want to include that as an option, and we could bring that to the full committee. The department's view when we created this is that we wanted to ensure that we left this as open as we could so that we ensured that students got support when they needed it, but there wasn't an artificial, the instructor has to reach out every week kind of concept. There are a number of programs that we have worked with and that we've answered questions about where it's not designed for an instructor to have a synchronous class every week. It's designed for the student to largely be responsible for his or her own learning, work through the course content, and be contacted and work with the members of an instructional team and get escalated to a subject matter expert when that person is needed, when the student needs extra support. So that was the concept that we used when we developed this language. But like I said, the idea of requiring direct interaction based on course content is an option that you guys can bring forward.
Jessica.
Thanks. A couple thoughts. First, I just want to reiterate, I just don't understand how this is authorized under the HEA, which requires, quote, regular and substantive interaction between the students and the instructor. My understanding, I just don't see any other purpose for broadening it to members of an instructional team, but to allow regular courses that do not have regular and substantive interaction between students and the instructor. Otherwise, they would already meet a definition, and they could obviously have other regular and substantive interactions. And I think more broadly, I think there's been a lot of talk here of what happens when courses work well or students reach out. Every student that reaches out can reach an instructor. I don't understand the purpose of opening it up Title IV funds beyond obviously correspondence courses, because that's what these would be if they don't meet this definition, to programs in which students can go through the whole course without ever seeing an instructor. I think students that struggle the most are the ones that are least likely to reach out. And I think that that article Amanda sent around last time explains that I think a lot of the students who struggle in online coursework are the ones who come in the least prepared. And so I just worry that this is sort of bifurcating a system where the students who are doing well reach instructors and are successful, and the students who are coming in with the most challenges are never going to see an instructor and just waste their Title IV and, go on IBR for 25 years. Then the taxpayers are funding their education that they got nothing out of.
Leah?
All right. So speaking from the perspective of an accreditor, I respectfully disagree that this language will align well with what accreditation has to do. It needs a major crosswalk to the recognition criteria, which specifically say faculty for accreditors. I'm concerned about at least one individual who was qualified by work experience. I think accreditors would face some major challenges from certain institutions that would waive this and say, hey, my faculty don't have to have degrees because for distance education it's defined as anybody that's qualified by work experience. And just understand that, there are many of us around the table that work wonderfully with students that are very responsible in how they deliver education, but I have encountered those that have not. And this type of language just goes to the heart of our worries about how distance education is delivered in a responsible way. So that's all I have to say about that. Just one other comment for the group is I feel like we're letting our passions for innovation and competency-based and direct assessment, which is kind of a narrow slice of what distance education enrollment is right now, kind of drive the conversation. We're seeing increasing enrollments in kind of the distance ed semester fixed time arrangement. We're seeing it starting to overtake what's happening on campus and on-ground enrollment. So, as we're thinking about this definition, maybe we could think about kind of the majority of the student body that's enrolled in distance ed right now, and the qualifications of the individuals that will be teaching them and guiding them along the way.
Jillian?
So I was going to say the same thing, which I think all need to remember that we're trying to build this for distance education, not for CBE. And I get it. I'm the biggest CBE fan, right? But this is so much bigger than that. And so making sure that we're creating it in a way that's going to provide protections and account for what is still the majority of distance education, which is not CBE at all. So I think I'm having to sort of check myself and remind myself about that. And I would just encourage all of us around the table to do that. 2 comments. One, I think maybe Amanda made the comment about requiring that subject matter expert or faculty or whatever to be doing something, right? So not just to be named a member of this team, but to actually be providing that instruction or sort of however we craft that language. I thought I heard when we met in January that largely we all thought that was important. And so I feel like that is still missing here a little bit because I feel like I could just build an instructional team, put a faculty member on it who doesn't ever do anything. And so I think that's a concern. I'm sorry, I know I use faculty sort of irresponsibly, Merity. Just take it for what I'm trying to suggest. Yeah, I get it. Yep. And then second, with respect to sort of in this part, this is an instructional team must ensure that it monitors student engagement, et cetera. I feel like this doesn't feel initiated by the faculty at all, and maybe that was intentional, but the phrase when needed on the basis of such monitoring or upon request by the student doesn't actually feel proactive at all. So I feel like that sort of conflates a little bit with the sentence before, or the line before that says promptly and proactively providing academic assistance.
One quick point. I apologize. Maybe we should have gone through the whole definition. We did intend for instructors or members of an instructional team to be the ones that reached out, and we'll get to that in the definition of regular in just a second.
Okay.
But go ahead.
So again, I think I used this example before, but I'm concerned about like Leah staffing a phone for 30 minutes a week and calling that meeting this requirement, when I think we would all agree that that would look more like correspondence education. Thanks.
David?
So Leah and Jillian, I hear you. And I share the same concern. So I think this isn't an easy problem to solve. The flip side is I think that as we look towards pedagogical innovation in higher ed. There's a lot of higher ed that's starting to look more and more like a healthcare stratified model of care, which doesn't mean that patients get bad care. It means that they get care from the people who are best suited to address the need. And I think the same thing is starting to happen in higher ed. And so actually a team approach to instruction is a good way to proceed. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be bad actors and that there can't be institutions that try to screw students. I mean, I get it, right? So I'm not sure how we bridge it, but sort of going back to the old definition and requiring that faculty, regardless how you define faculty, do the contact and the initiation does not guarantee good service to students, right? Quite the contrary. Often you get very cursory sort of, hey, you're fine, okay, let's on to the next one because I got to do my research kind of approach. And that's not very good either.
Marty.
It's interesting listening to this because I've tried to my history has been with publics who have been very committed to this. So I think, Jessica, but as you say, you're right. I come from it. My entire experience has been, how do we make this good? How do we have an outcome? We know what our university degree stands for. But I still like the team piece. And I hadn't thought, Leah, that the accreditors might get, I was kind of resting my hat on that piece, that the accreditors I've dealt with, which is 3 of the 6 regionals, have been pretty strong on what they qualify as a faculty subject matter expert, whatever terminology you want to use. So I hadn't really thought about the pressure coming back that way. And we know, and I think this was brought up in some of the communications, the backdrop of trying to loosen the accreditor model a little bit. That could be problematic. So I do think we need to get around it. But one of the things we're seeing as we talk about where traditional distance ed is growing, one of the things we're seeing in the large publics is replicating the lecture. So you have the faculty member of record, and then you have a number of sections underneath there. So you may have 100 people in an MBA class with a faculty member of record who's PQ and AQ qualified, so all your programmatic accreditation works. And then you have discussants. So it's very, very much the TA model, or broken into the lab model if you want to go to undergrad. So you have discussants that are more of an adjunct type model that is actually interacting with the student. And we see those classes, that's a bit of what's popping up in the traditional online public education piece. So I think the teams are still replicating themselves. My own thought is I hope we don't lose the team piece. I do see also the stratification that can happen from students who advocate for themselves and reach out to a faculty member, and those who don't, or to the academic. Now I'm using the term faculty too, but and we don't want that to happen too. So I hope we don't lose the gist of what's here, even if we have to add a little bit of language in to define the expectations, to ensure those channels are open and the schools are responsible for creating them. But let's not lose the team approach. That's my thought.
Leah.
I think we can get there because I value what a comprehensive team brings to the instructional model. And what I would say is let's look at the recognition criteria accreditors implement, and let's use that crosswalk that would say something like, accreditors assure that there is, a range of faculty expertise qualified by degree, qualified by experience, qualified by research that contribute to the learning enterprise. So I think that that's one way we can get this addressed, that we can preserve this concept, but strengthen what the accreditors' requirements are for their recognition. So that's.
Well, thank you. I think I believe that you're on a good path here in terms of trying to define something new for the survey results that we sent out to the group yesterday. That we had one institution that said TAs and GAs are specifically included, and we had another institution that said that their interpretation was that TAs and GAs are specifically excluded. So right now we have a lot of confusion on this, and I guess know that already. But so I think we're on the right path. We're moving towards these teams. We've had versions of it, but it's hard to get our hands around what that is. I do agree with the comments, though, about making sure that the instructor or subject matter expert or whatever we call it, that I've been sitting here trying to think of some term. I played with directs or manages or somehow is active and is not just a passive member of the team. I don't know how we put that in there, but I do agree with that point.
Since I don't see any other cards and we want to move on and get through as much as we can, I wanted to kind of recapitulate what I heard in the discussion today, and maybe ask folks to think about it and come back with suggestions tomorrow. Tomorrow is really the day when we're going to try to go through all of the regulatory language that we've talked about and try to arrive at recommendations that you guys can make to the full committee. So about the concept of an instructional team, I think I heard three things. I heard Jessica had a general objection to the instructional team concept and wanted to focus on the specific statutory language referring to as students and the instructor. I heard an objection to the concept of having a subject matter expert that is based on work experience and a desire to focus on the concept of faculty as the accrediting agency defines it. And I heard an objection about there not being a specific requirement for the subject matter expert to be working directly with the student or to otherwise have sort of oversight, control, et cetera, over the course. So if you guys want to look at those things and come back with suggestions for how we could improve, how this could be improved, we'd be really interested in hearing those things. So with that, let me go on to the next part of the definition, which is regular. With the definition of regular, we stuck with the concept of frequency and periodicity of contact that is established by the institution in accordance with accrediting agency or state requirements, in which, in Romanet 1, the interactions are initiated by an instructor or members of an instructional team, and then Romanet 2 has two components, A and B. So we tried to come up with, because we heard that there's a desire to ensure that there is some kind of standard for how regular interactions need to be, but there was not widespread agreement on what that could be. So the department made an effort that says for a course that is worth 3 or more credit hours, interactions occur at least once for each week of instruction. Keeping in mind that a week of instruction is defined as, and you guys have seen that in other red lines, but it's defined as a week where there's either scheduled instruction or where students are expected to work through coursework in our proposed definition. So that would preclude breaks becoming a problem. If there was a break that the school had incorporated, then obviously we wouldn't expect there to be interaction during that week. And then for a course that is worth less than 3 credit hours, interactions occur at least once every 2 weeks of instruction. So we just made it a little bit longer for courses that aren't as intensive. We tried to tie it back to the credit hour based on our discussion last time. We tried to do it in as simple and direct a way as we could, but we're open to suggestions about how we could do this better or whether this is too specific. And the last thing is substantive means related to the subject matter under discussion for the course. So we tried to keep that as simple as we could as well, given all of the other information that we'd included about instructors and members of an instructional team. And I'll stop there. Denise?
Denise.
I guess I just wanted to direct this to Leah and Jillian based on your proposal, because you were concerned, it looked like, about the setting a time, like once a week like we did here, and tying it to SAP. But as you guys know, as I told you last time, I'm the enforcement attorney. So I'm trying to figure out, we could try to work through that or get to where you guys might want to go. But how would we enforce that in terms of oversight? Yes, that's what I think we're trying to figure out, how we can meet the definition of regular in the statute with intervals, but also have the oversight piece. Go ahead.
So does the department in the financial aid process want to review this, or do you want to kick it to the accreditor? I mean, it seems like we're going back and forth as determined by the accreditor or as determined during a federal financial aid program review. And I guess, do we want this language to be used out in the field, during a program review? That's what we're getting to here. And do we want our program reviewers deciding that this is regular and substantive, or is this just something you want to move over into accreditation, which currently accreditors don't take a deep dive into regular and substantive? Well, DEAC has some processes, but typically there's not a lot. I'm just wondering, when you say enforcement, are you thinking the federal enforcement in a financial aid audit, or accreditation's role?
I think what we're looking at is for having some kind of parameters that meet the statutory definition, right? So we have to define regular somehow. We have to enforce regular somehow, in terms of, but also recognizing that we need to stay out of substantive statutory prohibitions and the academic criteria. So that's why we came up with, I think, the numbers, but it seemed like your proposal was concerned about having an interval once a week or twice a week and not being tied to subjects. So I guess that's maybe something that we could try to bridge. I was wondering how you might consider that applying, your proposal applying. I guess that's where I was getting at.
Because we were thinking about curriculum benchmarks along the continuum of instruction, right? So what are the appropriate points in time to have that engagement? Some courses are 5 weeks in length. Maybe 5 touches isn't going to be sufficient. Maybe it needs to be 10 or 15. Right. So it seems that once a week really doesn't get there. But if we're looking across an assessment continuum, maybe that's more appropriate. And I know that gets into territory that your folks just aren't comfortable with, right?
Or we can't.
Or you can't, right. So
I guess we're trying to come up with something that we can all live with, that gets us where we need to go and is consistent with the statutory definition and our prohibitions from getting into academic quality. So if you guys want to work on that, or if you're okay with the definition that we wrote, but it seemed like you weren't based on your proposal.
Jillian?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to that point, I would just say in general, with respect to this once a week, I just don't, it seems a bit arbitrary to me. I'm having a hard time understanding the why behind the once a week. And then to say that if a course is fewer credit hours, then it's even less than that. I guess I don't understand the distinction. A student could take a 2 credit hour course. If it was self-paced, they could get it done in a week. Does that mean they'll never hear from their faculty? That seems problematic. So I was going to make that comment. And then my other comment is just where it talks about interactions are initiated by instructor or member of instructional team. Again, my comment before feels like it doesn't have to be an instructor at all then if it's just a member of the instructional team. So that seems concerning.
With respect to the, regular number of times someone meets, I think we've struggled too with, when you're defining something like this, what is an adequate number of times? And I take your point. It seems arbitrary, but then again, any number we assign seems arbitrary. So, if we say it's 3 or 2 or whatever, in trying to, and I think these are all new models, but we're all drawn back to our own experiences, which is basically a brick and mortar type education. You think about how it was, how it was done. Generally, you signed up for courses that were Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday. But there were courses, I remember taking courses that met once a week. Those torturous 3 hour and 15-minute courses you had punctuated by the 1970s smoke break that no longer exists. So thinking about the fact that even in a very traditional setting, you could have courses where this occurs where the equivalent of, because it's not the equivalent of regular interaction, occurs only once a week. So we're trying to I think a lot of this kind of walks back to that, trying to find something to equate it to. So that's a little bit of the logic, but I fully concede that the number is not scientific. But then again, I would argue that any number we come up with is going to have some kind of an arbitrary nature to it, which isn't to say to preclude conversation around what might be better.
Knowing that, and again, we pulled this right off a PowerPoint that Dave did one time or several times, but knowing the department has used that phrase predictable and regular intervals in the past, I'd just be curious to know why that's not the approach that y'all have taken this time?
Yeah, that's a good question too. The reason that we are making an effort here to try to identify a specific time frame is mostly because of the many requests we've gotten from schools for some degree of certainty about what the requirement is. When we said that it was regular and didn't put any parameters around it, schools felt that there was a huge gray area that they would walk into when they designed their process for ensuring that there was regular and substantive interaction between students and the instructor, and felt that they weren't really able to innovate or push into that gray area because they were concerned about program reviews and the department coming in and cracking down. So this is an effort to provide more specificity and indicate to institutions where the lines are. But we do take your point that it's difficult to draw those lines given how long classes can be and how intensive or not intensive they might be, and that there might be some more appropriate number of interactions for a much more intensive course over a shorter period. And we're still working on how that could work. We're very interested in suggestions from this group on how to do that. But that's kind of the intent.
Verity?
Leah, would it work to do something where for a program, for one of these programs, that the requirement is that the institution have a definition per the term length, that matches term length and credit or whatever however you're accounting for that, that's proven to have gone through whatever their governance process is and is on file and approved by their accreditor, that would define what is predictable and regular for if we decide we're going to do a series of 3-credit courses in 4-week timeframes, let's say, that would have to be on file before it's eligible. Is that putting too much on the accreditors?
Well, I mean, if you think about a course that's offered 4 weeks or 12 weeks, the curriculum is the same. The faculty might be the same. All the assignments might be the same. Students in a 4-week course get touched 4 times. Students in the 12-week course get touched 12 times, right? If we're to apply this definition of once a week. Somebody brought up credit hour. I think it was you, David. I mean, if we're looking at all of the assignments and all of the learning activities that go into a credit hour, if we can use perhaps that continuum as evidence of regular and substantive interaction rather than the length of the course in weeks, and if we've documented the credit hour for the course, through work with the accreditor, then, we can show the Department of Ed when they come to do their handy program review, which we all love, by the way, right? Right. So we could show how these students and faculty are interacting over the activity schedule that's set forth to document the credit hour, if that made sense, I hope.
I think that's what I'm envisioning. So if we're saying, and hopefully if you're doing an action 4 weeks, you don't have the same assignments, but because it's kind of a different pedagogy, but let's say you do it in 4 weeks, that there is something with the accreditor that says, here's the expectation, and again, I know I'm going to how publics would do it. We'd have a communication plan with our students to make sure they understood the level of commitment, et cetera. But I'm wondering if we could take it there. So we put the onus on having something approved when you're going to go to shorter terms or whatever your delivery models are, that there's an agreement between the institution and the accreditor on what, I like predictable and regular, on what predictable and regular is for that length married to that credit hour, however you're doing it.
David?
Yeah, I do think that we are going to have to revisit the credit hour somehow and connect this. I just don't see how we avoid it. For me, the team approach and the periodicity and the credit hour are so intimately linked that I just don't know how we bifurcate it. And what makes it so from the innovation side, what makes it palatable for more periodicity is the team approach, because then that provides some flexibility to the institution. So anyway, 2 cents.
Thanks, guys. Yes,
Did you want to do another break?
Not quite. Well,
No pressure.
actually, Yeah, we could take a short break, maybe just a 5-minute break, because I'd like to get back and start talking about state authorization, but maybe give you guys a little bit more time to look through it. No, so that's the end of there. Oh yeah, so there's one more piece to this, and then there's a small change to the definition of correspondence course. So I do want to go back to.
Let's cover that first.
Okay. So first, let's talk about the correspondence course. So the only change that we made here was to add back the concept of is primarily initiated by the student for a correspondence course. That was something that a lot of folks in the group indicated was part and parcel of a correspondence course. Sorry, this is back on page 3. Page 3 at the top. Yep. So we just added back that phrase that was already there. So in a correspondence course, interaction is primarily initiated by the student, and that's all. Otherwise, we left it the way that it had been. The red line had been before. Any comments on that? If not, we can talk about the last piece of the definition of distance ed.
David.
Yeah.
Just a very quick comment. You might want to just change and may not be regular and substantive. Because it could be, right? And still be correspondence.
I'm trying to think of what circumstance you would have regular and substantive interaction and it would be correspondence as well, since that's the main differentiating factor.
Yeah, mail, exactly.
Oh, okay. We'll take that back and think about how we can incorporate that in there. So it doesn't. So you're saying if it doesn't fit into one of the electronic media requirements. Okay. So the last piece, and thank you, Tony. One of the more conceptual parts of this. This is the department was when we tried to put that definition of distance education back into the hands of the department. Well, and go to page 5. That's where this part of the definition is. We were concerned that the department would have trouble keeping up with technological innovations as they change over time, and doing new regulatory processes. As much as you guys enjoy this process, we might have to have it every year in order to do that, and we didn't think that was a good way to go. So we were trying to think of how the best way to effectuate, for lack of a better phrase, a sort of escape valve for innovations that are happening. So I'll read the language in a second, but just at a high level, what we envision is a process where an institution applies with its accrediting agency to say, I would like to do a new kind of distance ed program. It's not something in my reading of the regulations that fits into what's there now. But I think that it meets the statutory definition of regular and substantive interaction because we can't get away from the statutory definition. That's always going to be the baseline. If the accrediting agency approves and says, we think that this model has adequate faculty interaction, we think that that you're a good actor, we otherwise think that this could work, the accrediting agency could give it to the department. The department could look at it and say, okay, this institution, this program and this instructional model looks like it could meet the statutory definition, but just doesn't fit into our regulatory definition. The department could then publish in the Federal Register that this approach for this institution or this set of institutions does meet the statutory definition of distance education, so that there would be a defined process for the department and institutions and accrediting agencies all as partners to go through if they wanted to come up with a process that wasn't expressly covered in these regulations, because we acknowledge we might not always be able to get it exactly right. So what we have here is waiver authority, and that's under 5. It says, Under procedures established by the Secretary may, through publication in the Federal Register, permit an institution or group of institutions to define the courses in one or more educational programs as distance education rather than correspondence courses, using an instructional model that does not meet one or more of the requirements under paragraphs 1 through 4 of this definition, if the institution or institutions demonstrate that, and Romanet 1, the instructional model ensures that each course in the program or programs meets the statutory definition of distance education under 20 U.S.C. 1003, and that's the definition of distance education in the Higher Education Act. And each institution's accrediting agency has specifically reviewed and approved the educational program for which the institution seeks the waiver, and the agency has determined that the program meets all of its applicable requirements. Obviously, this is an early attempt at this concept, so we're interested in your feedback, and we know you might not have feedback yet. But
Russell?
Well, thank you for this, because I like where you're going in terms of the one sure thing is going to be is that there's going to be innovations that we cannot anticipate today, and so something that allows for that is really good. Second, we always like giving our friends in the accrediting agency more to do, because I know Leah wants more to do. And then third and final, I was wondering if you had any discussion about any, I could see where, given some of the other accrediting discussions where that's going, if you have new accrediting agencies, if there is any discussion among department staff about some sort of cap on this, or the need to watch how much this is used, because you could imagine a new accrediting agency coming in for the sole purpose of excluding everyone or doing all waivers, and so I wondered about that.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we'll take that back and think about it.
Jillian?
I have mostly the same comment as Russ. I was also going to say, I guess I haven't seen the department use this waiver authority before outside of X sites, and I'm just curious about sort of the statutory authority to be able to do that, because this looks new to me.
So the ability for the department to make specific kinds of changes to its requirements in the Federal Register has well-established precedent. We do it for verification. We have some established parameters in the regulations about what the department is going to be looking at, but the department decides based on its own analysis of data every year what exactly the data elements are that we're going to look at, and we establish that in the Federal Register every year. Similarly, we also establish certain timeframes for reporting, again, in our systems. A lot of that is to do with the fact that systems change, timeframes change. We need to have some ability to be flexible. So there is a limited use for the Federal Register if it's established in the regulations that that's going to be a vehicle for certain kinds of things. But to your point about the statute, we can't get around, and we wouldn't want to get around the statutory definition of distance education. So that is always going to be the baseline. And frankly, regardless of how this process works, if it ever were to become a process, the department would ultimately have to review to ensure that it believes, and probably in conjunction with our general counsel's office, that the model would meet the statutory definition of regular and substantive interaction. So there is some ability for the department to use the Federal Register in this way. As you said, it hasn't been done before for something like this, I would say, but it has been used in other parts of our own regulations.
David?
Just a clarification question for you, Dave. There seems to be an assumption that distance education programs are all made up of courses. Is there anything which of course isn't true. So is there anything that precludes non-course based?
So that's a good question, and it does have an answer. When the department regulated on the definition of a correspondence course, a very long time ago, I think, probably in the 90s, we thought of this, thankfully, and there are basically two options. Either a program is built using courses, or it's not. If it's built using courses, then the definition of correspondence versus distance ed happens at the course level. If it's not based on courses, then the definition happens at the program level. and there would have to be a determination at the program level. Now, I don't know exactly what the department had in mind with that, and it may have been looking primarily at, for example, clock hour programs at the time when it was thinking about that, or programs that just didn't have the traditional kind of concept of courses. But that is what's in the regulations currently.
And do those programs get approved at the accreditor or at the department? Like, for instance, project-based programs?
When you say approved, what do you mean?
Well, so let's say an institution wants to launch a project-based program where the projects are varying sizes in terms of credits. Does that have to get approved directly by the department or not?
No, that's an accrediting agency decision. If it's, and I don't want to speak to how the accreditors would handle that, but the department would accept the state and the accrediting agency's determination about whether that was something that they could approve. Though, to your other point, ultimately, the department views its responsibility to be to oversee and enforce the requirement of whether a program is or is not distance education or correspondence. And so that's what Denise was getting at earlier. We believe that it's our responsibility to enforce that provision, and so we would do that in accordance with our program review process, which is how we enforce all of the department's rules.
Jessica.
Thanks. I agree with Russ that I would want any waiver authority to be cap-end so that it doesn't become an exception that swallows the rule. I think particularly temporally, so if, an institution were to undergo like a change of control or significant financial changes, that this authority wouldn't just last in perpetuity. Also, I'm no general counsel, but I just don't quite understand how you could have a statute with terms that are then defined in regulations, and then the agency in the Federal Register says that a certain thing meets the statutory definition of those terms, which isn't defined anywhere except for the regulation, but it doesn't meet the regulatory terms. So I don't quite understand what that would mean here, because it seems like regular, substantive, and then the modes of delivery are the things that the statute requires, which are the exact same things in the regs.
Okay, I'm not completely understanding, but I think what Dave was saying is this just gives us an ability to look at other kinds of programs that aren't in existence now, but we would still get back to looking at them under the structures of the statutory definition. So I'm not quite understanding what you're saying.
Sure, but I think the main parts of the statutory definition are regular, substantive, and delivery models, which are exactly what's defined in the regs. So I guess it's confusing. I just don't know how an institution or an accreditor would understand this program is regular, substantive, and use the delivery models in a way that would satisfy the statutory definition. So Ed will approve it under our waiver authority, but doesn't meet the regulatory definitions. So we can't just go under the regulatory authority. You don't need to answer now. I just don't quite understand how the statutory and regulatory definitions could be different for the same words.
Okay.
It's 11 o'clock. Did you still want to take a break, or do you want to go to noon?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Let's do short break, 5 minutes, and we'll come back and talk about state authorization.
Okay. 5 minutes. Greg, have your smoke. Okay, well, we have one placket up. It's Meredith.
I just want to follow up a little bit on our conversation before we left. And I don't know, this may not fit into this exact process, but thinking on the conversation of trying to plan for what we don't know, but it's probably already happening, if there was a place we could have almost a permanent X site, so we could already have the regulations up, and it's a relationship between the institution, Department of Ed, and the appropriate accreditor. So it keeps some of those guardrails on. And I don't know how we would do that, but I wonder if there's a way you would apply to have a program within this kind of permanent X site, and it would take a sign off between the institution, your accreditor, and Department of Ed. And during that period, there would be extra oversight, the same way we do a traditional X site. There'd be extra reports, oversight, accounting, et cetera.
Take that idea back. Thank you. All right, so we'd like to move on to the concept of state authorization for distance education. So I'd like to start with the definition of a reciprocity agreement, which is on page 8 at the top. And we're also handing out some language that's been provided to us by Carolyn and Sue. So what we'd like to do is go through what the department has proposed, and then talk about the different options proposed. I think we had one from Sue and Carolyn, and we also had one from Russ and his team. And we'd like to talk about the differences between them and the subcommittee's views on each approach. All right. Oh, and yeah, be careful. There's each of them has 2 pages, so hopefully we haven't lost any already on the way around. All right, so going to page 8 at the top. So just want to go through some of the things that that the department did here. We based all of these changes on our discussion last time, and what we heard last time was some general support for a definition of reciprocity for state authorization, and we also heard both support for the concept of the reciprocity agreement not prohibiting a state from enforcing its own laws and regulations. And we also heard the opposite, where there were concerns about requiring that, given that some of those laws and regulations might make it difficult for institutions to enter into a reciprocity agreement and not have to fulfill 50 different state requirements. So the department, the first thing that we did was actually kind of technical. We just moved around the words reciprocity agreement for state authorization. And this is cosmetic, but it's intended to avoid the accidental confusion between the department's regulatory definition and NC-SARA, which we found happened a lot, and we want to avoid that. So even though it's maybe a little silly, we just move the words around, and we think it helps. We hope that we'll avoid that confusion. What we did then was we essentially left the definition mostly alone, except that we replaced the concept of the definition, the reciprocity agreement not prohibiting a state from enforcing its own laws with and does not result in a conflict between a state's statutes and regulations and the requirements of the agreement. And that language largely brings in the department's guidance that we passed around last time, where we indicated that we didn't believe that a reciprocity agreement that conflicted with a state's laws would be acceptable for the department's purposes, and that we would expect the state and the other states in the reciprocity agreement to work out those conflicts before the reciprocity agreement was considered to be in effect. And so that's what we have here. And I'll pause there, see if you guys have questions about that, and then we can go on to the other definitions.
Carolyn?
Maybe I should just wait until we talk about the other definitions.
So let's pause, and then I think, yeah, can we go to Carolyn's and Sue's definition?
Okay, well, I think as was expressed in our previous conversation, there are concerns about state authorization reciprocity agreements leading to situations where students aren't protected in the states, and our concern was that this is not good for this does not should not be the policy that the department is sanctioning here if they're going to be permitting state authorization reciprocity agreements as a way to achieve this. And so to protect students, the department should retain the language, this is our proposal, is that the department retain the language from 2016 that the department put in there explicitly to protect online students and give them the same protections in their states as students enrolled at traditional brick and mortar schools. And there was some concern that would kind of go against the whole idea of a state reciprocity agreement, which is to make it easier for schools to operate in more than one state. And I think my response to that would be that there certainly is an issue where schools want to be able to operate in more than one state, and there could be barriers to entry, like, for example, licensing fees and or authorization fees to operate in multiple states, and that the reciprocity agreement certainly has a function that the department and consumer protection concerned agencies would support in that getting rid of those barriers to entry by making there be a smoother and easier way for schools to operate in multiple states without having to for example, pay a fee or whatever it is, sort of the barrier to entry. But once a school is operating there, then in our view, the consumer protection should not be eroded for those students just because they're in an online school. And so in order to make that happen, states need to be able to enforce their general consumer protection laws, which concern fraud, unfair and deceptive practices, and also education-specific rules. So that's what we're proposing. And what the department has proposed does not, the language that the department has proposed in terms of changing the 2016 language does not, in my view, address the concern that we raised with these agreements eroding consumer protection by prohibiting states from enforcing education-specific rules such as disclosure requirements on those states, and the issue of conflict is not really helpful to that here at all. And there could be disagreement as to whether education-specific laws should be applied, but I don't think, and I just want to make one more point, that there was really any disagreement that laws of general application such as fraud and unfair and deceptive practices. So if you're going to take out the language that's helpful to consumers, I don't know why you would take out all of it, since I don't think there was any problem with the idea that general laws would apply, because even NC Sarah agrees with that, and kind of taking that out makes me worried that maybe NC Sarah thinks that we shouldn't even be able to enforce our fraud and unfair and deceptive practices laws, and that's even more alarming. So I don't know why we would take that out too, unless there's a reason that I don't understand. So anyway, so Sue and I's proposal is to keep that in. And should I talk about the second part, or should I wait for that until we discuss this further?
You have Sue over here.
Oh, sure. Unless you want to talk about this, you want me to? Okay. Okay. So the other thing that Sue and I had talked about was that this is an agreement between states, and that there's a concern that that the policy that governs this, an agreement between the states, should be something that's governed and controlled by state members, and that consumer protection, should have a role in this. So, what if the NC Sarah board decides that they don't want general laws of general protection application like fraud or consumer protection laws, and they want to change it? States always have the opportunity to get out of the agreement. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of actually influencing the policy while we're in the agreement, because people, most states obviously think it's a good idea that these things exist, we feel like it's very important that that the portal agencies and other member state agencies have a role. So that's why we suggested this language for consideration about actually how the reciprocity agreement is governed, and that it should be it should reflect the views of the states and not be something that is, if it is in fact a state member agreement, it should reflect that. And we just wanted to bring that out for a discussion. So what we've proposed is that the definition include language that not only that a reciprocity agreement that fits this definition would permit states to enforce general and specific education law, consumer protection laws. It would also be governed and controlled by member states. And one way to ensure that would be to require that at least 50% of positions on a governing board be filled by member state education officials, and that one position be allocated to a representative of a state attorney general's office or an organization that represents represents the interests of consumers and students.
Okay, Sue.
Thank you for considering this, so that we don't have to be doing this a year from now. I think the reason that we wanted to protect what we currently have within each of our states is that we don't want this so tight and so written to only one organization, being NC-SARA. And although it is a wonderful, and we support state authorization reciprocity agreements, I want to be clear on that. We don't want to strip the student consumer protection that we have in each of our states. And I think you will see that that's where some of the states who are either late in coming to it or are not in it yet have some grave concerns. And also I want to tell Carolyn I appreciate her getting on the phone with our state portal agency, because I did go back and visit with them about some of the language, as well as their chief compliance officer. And as we look at governance, it seems to be that may be one thing that's really missing from the current structure. And we want to ensure that the governance piece will endure time and that it would last. And some of the recommendations I know from our local steering committee that I'm a part of, the MEC steering committee, though it seems to be falling on deaf ears. So we just want to make sure that this works well as we look forward, and that hopefully we have state authorization that will endure time.
I believe Jillian was up next.
So thanks for sharing this. I was going to just make a comment because I feel like the department's attempt, and I think we're all trying to do the same thing, right? But how do we sort of clarify this language around state laws and sort of what's covered and what's not? It seems like maybe a simpler solution with respect to that is clarifying that state reciprocity agreements only cover sort of the ability to operate or the licensing authority, and not sort of extends into sort of the consumer rules, because isn't that the point, right? To try and make sure that schools can get approved to operate in states. It's not to I don't even think it should really speak to sort of the consumer law piece, because I don't think that that's what the purpose of SARA or a state reciprocity agreement is. So maybe if it just clarifies that this is specific to a school's ability to operate in a state. I don't know.
Russell?
Well, I'd like to speak in favor of the conflict language. I like where that is going in terms of each of the states has affirmatively, that are members of SARA at this point, have affirmatively agreed to follow those rules, and that there are rules that go across, not only the operations, but some of the things we use the word consumer protection. And what happens is that I worry that if we open it up to any of the rules, any of the specific rules, that the problems that we run into is that what's consumer protection in one state is defined differently in another state, and you start having a situation where once again we're back to where we were at square one, where there is no benefit to reciprocity at all, because each state is able to apply its own rules. And again, back to in most of the states, not all of them. It was, an act by the legislature and the governor to agree to be part of this. In terms of again, back to protecting students, that there's actually more students protected because of reciprocity agreements than there was before there was one there, including in some of the states around the table here that students are protected that were not or would not currently be protected under state law, but they are under SARA. The last thing is about the general, and I'd be fine. I think would be if you wanted to keep the language about keeping in the general, because that was always something that was agreed to, that anything that's by general applicable, that misrepresentation, outright fraud, those sorts of things, that certainly there should be protections against those activities.
Jessica.
Thanks. I obviously agree with the choir that the laws of general applicability should be in here. I think it's helpful to think about this from an individual student perspective. So if I'm a student in New York City, I can attend a brick and mortar school in New York. I can attend a distance ed school that is a New York school, or I can attend an out-of-state school. And I see, to Jillian's point, the advantage of the out-of-state school being able to easily get authorization in New York, get set up, get off the ground. I'm just not sure how the student is best served by, of those three choices, to having to comply with the laws the legislature passed to protect me, and the third, not having to. And in particular, I wonder if there is an adverse effect on in-state institutions, for example, a community college that could potentially be a direct competitor, whereas that community college would have to follow all the rules that are designed to protect me. And if this out-of-state program undercuts that somehow because it doesn't have to follow those rules, in my mind, the student is ultimately best served by all those choices of institution having to follow the same rules.
Robert.
I really appreciate this discussion, particularly representing the state higher education executive officers. I reached out to those who are involved with the authorization process, and all of them were unanimous in wanting that consumer protection, that control over general regulations, and that they would really like to see that language stated there. I thought what Julian stated was some nice language as far as how we might address some of that. And Massachusetts was very clear as far as the specific regulations and wanting to maintain that. Most of my other members somewhat understand that they appreciate NC SARA and what it provides. Of course, no medium of this kind is going to be perfect. They're not messy, but they appreciate what it provides them with that reciprocity, and they kind of understand how that process works, and when you entertain that and enter that, that some of those specific regulations are somewhat being dealt with in a compromising type of manner, but all want that language around general, and we'd like to see that included.
Marty.
Jillian, can I just get clarification? Because what I thought I heard you say, but then from the agreement of folks around the table, I'm thinking I heard it wrong, is if the idea between reciprocity is so we get the ability to operate within a state, but it doesn't come with the consumer protection piece of it, I don't see then where does that come in? And so I'm wondering if I understood, or if you could better define what you were meaning when you said that.
Yeah, so I was suggesting that to the extent that reciprocity agreements are recognized, that it should be just as a pathway to getting authorized in a state. It should not circumvent that school's oversight by a state from a consumer law perspective. So, and I don't think this language in here that talks about does not result in a conflict. I just don't feel like it gets there. I don't personally necessarily think that reciprocity agreements should prevent that institution from being subject to the laws that are in a particular state. I think it should just be about what is that pathway to get authorized, and how do we clarify that that's what we're talking about within the scope of reciprocity agreements.
So then would there be a separate step that says, okay, now you're authorized to offer your program in the state, then is there a second? I'm not quite sure if I get what that second step is, to say, are you matching student protection? And I think there's a bit, the other piece I wanted, being a Sarah advocate, it wasn't for the high-level protections, it was for the low-level protections in differences in states, in processes, a number of days to do things, and different things that you can't have published policies anymore because it depends on where the state comes from, what they require, and it's nuances, 5 days difference in how long they have to petition something. It's, some of it's nominal differences, but get very hard for the university or institution to stand behind. So I think when we talk protections too, there's two levels of protections. And I feel like we had this discussion last time we met a bit with high level versus procedural. But I was wondering, once they get permission to be in New York and New Jersey, what's the control to make sure they're dealing with at least the high level consumer protection values of that state?
Thank you for the conversation. This has been helpful for us. I think I heard a lot of support for, at a minimum, including language about laws of general applicability somewhere in this definition to ensure that no reciprocity agreement ever prohibited a state from enforcing those laws. And the department will take that back and we'll discuss that. The other, I think I heard a couple of different views on this, some support for Carolyn's definition, and also some concern about whether that definition would still result in a multitude of state requirements. But I think we may have at least a couple of options in this case that we could present to the main committee. So if this is one that I'd like to come back to tomorrow after we give it a little bit more thought, if you guys have red lines that you think could help, I think I'm going to turn to my colleagues here. I think I'd like to have us go back and change our red line on the general applicability so that that's just incorporated into ours, and then we can come back. And if you guys want to work on an alternative, something that works with Carolyn's, et cetera, we'd be willing to talk about how we could present that to the main committee tomorrow. Russ, one quick question for you. You had in your language, you took out, I think, everything related to state laws and statutes. Do you prefer that, or do you prefer what the department has come up with? So I'm wondering whether we should consider that as we keep these discussions going.
I think the department's language is much clearer.
So we really have just two options that we can kind of work within to present to the committee. Okay. Anything else on that for now? If not, I'd like to turn to the actual state authorization requirements for distance ed. That starts on page 16 near the bottom. And so some general points. Again, the department heard a lot of support for,
I'm just, with the Sarah definition, I'm just not sure that we got to the second part of their proposal. I don't know if we were planning to discuss it now or not.
I apologize if I skipped over that. So yeah, Carolyn, please, let's talk about that part of it.
Okay, so as Sue mentioned, there was some concerns from state regulators and other members that the policy-making, decision-making governing board of NC Sarah right now has very few spots that actually include state officers of higher education member states, and that seemed strange to us and kind of concerning because there is the opportunity that there could be major changes to policies that the member states wouldn't necessarily have a direct voice in. And due to that concern, we thought it would be appropriate to have some language actually in the definition that would ensure that member states are actually directly represented in governing the policies of the agreement. So that's where that proposal came from. Also, we thought it might make sense to have at least one person on the board. I believe right now there are something in the range of 22 people on the board, something like that, that came from a consumer perspective, a consumer protection perspective, since that seems to be an important issue for Sarah. So we thought it would maybe make sense to have one person out of the 22 or whatever be from that perspective. So either from a state agency that does consumer protection, like as the state attorney general's office, or from a nonprofit organization that works to represent interests of consumers and students. That would be worth discussing.
Did you want to continue?
Any other comments about that part of Carolyn's definition? If not, then we can go on. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to articulate concerns about that. I mean, because SARA is, NC SARA or any other type of state reciprocity agreement is really a private enterprise, the idea of the federal government dictating board membership of that private enterprise is concerning. I'd be surprised if SARA were ever able to be formed under those conditions in the first place. If you had mandated state, participation, states do have a role in SARA in that they can decide to participate or not, but once they decide whether they're participating, they that's it. I don't think that this would be a good idea at all.
Leah.
Okay, what I asked Denise was, so I'm on the SARA board, so just wanted to make sure the committee knew that. And I asked Denise, is it a conflict for me to make any comments about this? And I think you said just keep it.
Yeah, I mean, as
keep
long
it
as you disclose and
yeah.
keep it in general.
Right. So I just wanted to speak to a little bit about, the involvement of states in SARA. It is a private organization. This would kind of create a recognition process in some ways for the SARA board, if we start creating rules around how their organization structure meets the requirements for state authorization. So SARA is comprised of these regional compacts, and they have 4 seats on the SARA board through this regional compact. The work of SARA involves the states deciding which institutions are eligible. The SARA board doesn't pick and choose which institutions get to have reciprocity. That rests with the states. And so the states have their process of reviewing institutions, and then through the regional compact system, they get appointed to SARA. So, I see that as a critically important role for the state in deciding which schools get in and which schools meet the requirements and expectations for reciprocity. I think that this would be an important topic for the board to consider and reflect upon. I can ask Marshall Hill if he would like to speak to any of these things. Maybe it would be good for you to hear from him directly about this matter, because I think it would represent a major shift in the governance of SARA and its establishment as kind of an independent nonprofit entity.
Sue?
I think part of what we are trying to present here is that on down the road, and this idea really came about from our state portal agency, saying what would prevent the various state portal agencies from developing a state authorization reciprocity agreement. So much of the language or what we are talking about here is around one, and that is the NC SARA, which exists today and has been terrific. But down the road, if states choose not to be a member of that, is there another option? So that is the idea, that we wanted to frame this in such a way that it's not just around one organization, but around the idea of state authorization reciprocity agreements. I hope that clarifies that.
Marty?
Just real quickly, I kind of hope we don't go that path, because I now see us like shopping accreditors, shopping compacts. I think the whole thing perfect or not, I think the whole thing behind this was to have one place where schools could know they were in compliance and know they were good. So that's my own thought. You know, I'd rather fix what we have than start competing compacts.
Go ahead, Robert.
And as far as my own membership, I would say most would fall in with what Meredith just said. I don't think they would want to start over. We can tweak what we have. Frankly, I think some of what's suggested, I'm already getting a few comments coming in, is my SHIOs would find it somewhat problematic. They've put a lot of efforts into this at the highest of their state level in helping their state come on board with SARA, and it would be starting over to a certain degree in a lot of these states. So most of them, anyway, are pretty happy with what they have. Not all of them. There's 50 unique states, and there are several. I mentioned Massachusetts specifically that had reached out that would like to see some changes to this for sure.
Jessica.
I just think at the highest level, state authorization is supposed to be a main piece of the triad, and I think everybody acknowledges that one of the pieces really is protection. And so I understand state authorization reciprocity agreements. The best way I understand them is basically a state sort of waives a lot of its abilities to do the things that it's set up under the HEA to have to do. And so I think I support sort of the biggest picture piece of this, which is to make sure states are actively involved all the time in protecting their students. But I, as someone who doesn't do this every day, I like totally hear what everybody's saying about this isn't a way to make sure that like continued and active state involvement in consumer protection is happening. And so I want to say at the highest level, I'd like to think about ways to maintain states' involvement in protecting their students. And I hear your thoughts.
Jody.
Yeah, so to respond to Jessica, first, my understanding of the triad is that the state role has always been from a consumer protection standpoint and not specifically with respect to state quote unquote authorization. Our institutions have had a lot of difficulty ever since both the brick and mortar state authorization requirements went into place and with the state authorization for distance education requirements. With respect to the regular state authorization language, we had institutions that were in effect for hundreds of years and literally couldn't produce documentation naming the so-called state authority. I mean, we had people running around to like libraries in every towns, getting mayors to sign letters to the department, having institutions that have existed for hundreds of years be told that they no longer could participate in Title IV. So I caution us about using the word state authorization for the state role when really it's always been more of a consumer protection piece. But then as far as the SARA is concerned, my understanding was that SARA was created in large part to, and again, I wasn't around for this, but that it was created to, because the state authorization for distance education regulations that we are currently talking about were basically virtually impossible for any institution to comply with. And so SARA was created as a mechanism for states to be able to continue to have their distance education practices. So that's why, from our perspective, the state authorization for distance education piece has really been nothing but a burden on our institutions, private nonprofit institutions. I think it's less of an issue for publics that are automatically deemed to be authorized by virtue of their status as a state entity. And so, yeah, SARA to me was a solution to a problem created by the regulations themselves.
Russell.
Yeah, I wanted to address the state waves. And it is a state-to-state agreement that is managed by SARA. And so the only entity that can enforce the rules is SARA, is the state. That the state has its regulations, and to join it, what they've done is that they have affirmatively agreed, often through the legislature and through the governor, that they will use the rules that are the same as all the other states that are part of the agreement. and that those were the rules that they will apply to the subset of institutions that are SARA members who are operating in that state. So we hear that a lot about it's outsourcing compliance or it's waiving compliance, but it's really the states are still involved, and they're the ones that are doing this. And then with that, I was going to pass on the carving out consumer protection thing, but I, having been part of discussions of some of this, is that the problem that you get into in trying to start down that is that there's no end to it, because there's each state wants to do something different for consumer protection. I do really feel we'll get back to where we were when we started.
Go ahead, David.
Jody, did you already make your comment? Okay, just want to be sure. All right, so yeah, want to move on to page 16, which is the regulation, which are the regulations under 34 CFR 600.9, which define the requirements for state authorization. And the department, in listening to the discussions last time, heard a lot of our subcommittee members indicate that the concept of reciprocity is meaningless without a direct connection to the department's requirement for authorization. So understanding that, the department put back much of the definition that had been promulgated in the 2016 regulatory language, with some exceptions. One exception is that the department changed the concept of residence to location, given Russ's comments about the difficulties that the concept of residence created in the original language. And the other more major change was about the state complaint processes. So whereas, well, first, and the department also, I'll get to that in a second, but first, the department indicated specifically that for purposes of 600.9 for state authorization, an institution makes a determination about the state in which a student is located at the time the student is admitted to the program. This was part of the discussion last time that we tried to incorporate into the rules here, where a student, when the school enrolls a student, it needs to figure out where the student is located, and that's the only time that the institution does that, and that's the determination that will affect all the other rules that are related to where a student is located. And so that was an incorporation of that discussion. Let me pause. Is there any questions about those things first, Russ?
Yeah, I don't think the students are really, covered or protected under the part where it's just when the student is admitted for the location. And so what I did is I went back to some language that was previously put out, I think it was 2012 or something like that, that looked at it, that it was I can look back and find it, but it was when you determine, because it's where the student is located when they receive the instruction. So if you do it just where they're admitted, that I could be admitted in Kansas, but I do all my instruction in Colorado. But it's the Colorado laws that will then affect me, because that and will affect the institution and will affect the student. And so we need to follow that. We need to follow where the student is. And so I thought the language was pretty good that the department put out in 2012, where they tied it to federal financial aid determination, and then that every time that for that student that you determine their financial aid eligibility, there's a whole list of things that you have to do for the student, and that this would just be another one of those. And for different institutions that rather than trying to go every year or every semester, that tying it to finance, since this is a financial aid thing, tying it to that seemed to make a lot of sense to me, and being more proactive. But you're not requiring the institution to know where the student is every time in between, all the times in between, because they may have that time that they're in Colorado, but they then move 2 weeks later, or they're reassigned in the military. Well, you did it at a census point, right?
Meredith.
I think Russ got to where I was going to go, that we have to have a one time that we do it. I'm a little confused on when that time is. If we don't do it when they apply, when exactly when that happens in financial aid, so if you could explain that to me.
Okay, so for every student, you have to go through a process to determine whether they're eligible for federal financial aid, and you have to figure out, okay, if it's I don't know if it's just males anymore, have they registered for the draft? And, there's a whole bunch of other things that you have to do. So it's beyond admitted. It's to where you're going to enroll the student, and actually you're determining if they're eligible for aid and how much aid that they're able to get. So at that point, as part of that process, you need to figure out where they're going to be located when they take the instruction.
So it would then only apply to students who fill out a FAFSA? I guess the application, the piece I liked about that is it's each and every student at one time. And you're also consistent with, you haven't started to mislead a student, where suddenly it's, here's the information you gave us, here's where we've told you whether or not we can serve you, whether our program's accredited, whether you'll get licensure in your state, all the pieces that go with that.
It's just that I think that you run into all sorts of problems with the time between application and the student actually getting aid and getting all that. I'm hoping that, to your point about informing students that haven't really looked closely at what's in the disclosures in the back that's remaining, but I'm hoping that the disclosures will protect those students so that they know that the institution is approved in whatever state that they're going to be in, that they know know several other things that would be in disclosures if they're in professional licensure programs or the such.
Then how would you do the students who don't fill out a FAFSA?
These are federal financial aid rules.
Well, I get that, but isn't it that my understanding is the institution, and maybe I misunderstood, that I was under the impression that we were supposed to be doing this for all students, not just those getting federal financial aid. So the way I've always played it was any student going to our program is supposed to have these same protections. And so that's where so if we're to see where they live, we would need to know that.
Yeah, you're supposed to be doing it for, you are supposed to be doing this for all students. But the purpose of this is, what are the rules for federal financial aid? When you start doing it for students who don't have federal financial aid, there may be other rules that start applying just with the particular states or with reciprocity or however they're approved in the state. But what we're trying to do is set up what is the process so that there's one process for federal financial aid.
So would I, and maybe I've misunderstood this for a week or a decade, if XYZ University has students that are not, that are from a state where we're not approved to offer distance education programs, and we get complaints that we're not treating Massachusetts students well, and if I were to come back and say, but they're not financial aid students, would we be left alone, or would they still go after us for a fine? So I think I go back to, in the trying to get the institutions to be able to comply with some type of reasonableness. I think sitting it at a place that every student does, no matter what, just makes, I get your point on the timing helps, but as far as trying to not trip institutions up, I think sitting it at a point that we know every student takes the action of applying. And so therefore it's a good time to be able to grab it.
Yeah, and following up on that, I would say that one of the department's interests is trying to keep any requirements that are set here to be as close to how states generally handle this, but with the understanding that states all have different ways of determining whether an institution is authorized to operate within the state. If they're part of a reciprocity agreement, yes, those might be standardized, but a state might decide, for example, that a school needs to identify where the student is located annually. The federal government might have a different and less restrictive requirement. My point is, we would like to make sure that the two are as consistent as they can be, but we acknowledge that there may not be a way to be completely consistent. So we may determine that we ultimately use this standard of once, or if we find that it would work to do it every year, we could do it every year. But we want to be as consistent as we can be without creating unnecessary burden. That's the department's goal with these regulations.
We have David, Marity, and then Lunch.
So I just want to reinforce Merity's point because I think it's critically important. We have to treat students the same, regardless of whether they're eligible for aid or not, right? So the process needs to be the same regardless.
Merity.
I would just make a quick comment that I do hope as we look at the frequency of these checks, the more often we do it with the student, the more often it could be the odds are that the student moves to a state where the institution doesn't have a right to deliver their program, and suddenly the student gets stuck halfway through with, we can't serve you anymore because we're not able to deliver in that state. So the student gets stuck having to opt out or having to leave an academic program.
David.
I think that's a good place to leave off before lunch. We will, after lunch, I think we'll come back to this and we'll wrap up our discussion on state auth. So we've got a couple more things. One is the complaint process requirement as part of state authorization. And the second component is our disclosures related to state authorization for distance education. So we're going to come back to that after lunch. And hope you guys have a lovely hour and 15 minutes because we'd like to come back, as Greg, I think we haven't talked about this, but on the agenda, we'd like to come back at 1:15. All right. Thanks, everybody.